Hi everyone, Javy here. Today I'm going to be talking about F.E.A.R, a first-person shooter from 2005 developed by Monolith Productions. Don't worry too much about spoilers if you've never played F.E.A.R before, as the goal of this video is to get people to either try out the game for the first time or revisit it. So we'll be going over mild spoilers when it comes to F.E.A.R's plot. But before we get into any of that, let's take a quick detour to talk about some scary movies. The action horror genre is one built on paradoxical foundations. Horror sets out to frighten and make the audience feel disempowered by having them confront monsters, both those of our imagination and the ones out in the real world. Action, on the other hand, is wholly interested in making the audience feel a hero's pursuit and incremental gains of power in his or her journey to take on an antagonist. Such a combination presents a real obstacle for creators. How do you make the audience feel powerful and disempowered at the same time? And how do you make that effect entertaining? As is often the case, the devil is in the details. But largely, the answer comes down to how you balance tones, and which elements from those genres you choose to emphasize. Aliens, the quintessential action horror movie, largely succeeds because of how its action and terror manage to coexist in the same space. Aliens' best scenes are often fixated with the tension that comes before the weapons pop off, when all eyes are on the motion trackers as hordes of xenomorphs grow ever closer, culminating in fantastic standoffs that deliver all the adrenaline-pumping responses you might have while watching something like Die Hard, but undercutting it with the terrifying realization that the xenomorphs' numbers easily drown out whatever firepower advantage the Marines initially have. Once that fact is established, the tension of the situation cuts through every moment.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. What the fuck are we gonna do now?
So movies have figured out how to do action horror right. But what about video games? What makes an action horror game work? Well, like films, it's a balancing act. Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space, two of gaming's most beloved action horror titles, feature protagonists who find themselves with their backs against the wall, surrounded by all manners of ghastly monsters and terrifying situations. However, both Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space eventually surrender to the action part of action horror. Through the constant dollops of power-ups and new weaponry, as well as the confidence instilled in the player by surviving so many tense encounters with enemies, it's inevitable that these games become journeys largely concerned with achieving victory through power and perseverance. Shedding the horror element isn't a flaw, really, but more of adhering to the blueprint of the genre. For most action horror experiences, the acquisition of power and victory are inevitably the focus. Unless we're talking about F.E.A.R. F.E.A.R does something different. Taking place in the year 2025, F.E.A.R focuses on a private military group called Armacam Technology Corporation, ATC for short. The ATC has managed to create a group of deadly soldiers capable of being telepathically controlled, which would be bang for our folks at ATC if the commander of said super soldiers, Paxton Fettel, hadn't gone rogue, wiping out nearly every living soul at corporate headquarters for reasons that aren't immediately apparent. You play as the Point Man, a member of the Special Ops Group First Encounter Assault Recon. Your goal is to track down and kill Fettel. Seems like a standard 90s action flick plot with maybe a tinge of sci-fi, right? But players quickly discover an integral part of F.E.A.R's artistic success is that it takes this sort of by-the-numbers action story setup and adjusts it bit by bit, sidestepping and sometimes directly challenging your expectations.
Someone.
More on that later. For now, let's talk about the first-person shooter elements of F.E.A.R and why they're so damn good. Now, at first glance, there's admittedly nothing special about F.E.A.R's combat. You enter a space, usually small like a locker room or a hallway, sometimes biggish places too, lobbies and warehouses, and you fight a squadron of soldiers, with a variety of weaponry including pistols, shotguns, and whatever the hell this is. However, F.E.A.R has a few key elements that help make this loop pretty special. F.E.A.R's version of slow-mo, the one superhuman ability you have access to, slows down the events around you to just the right speed, so gun battles go from being quick exchanges of muzzle flashes and slumping bodies to violent, blood-soaked orchestras where you are the conductor. F.E.A.R's physics and sound design are unbeatable. Once players become accustomed to how slow-mo works in conjunction to your abilities and weaponry, every firefight has the same intensity and cinematic charisma of the infamous lobby shootout from The Matrix and the gunfight at the end of Django Unchained. There has never been more sinuous combat in the first-person shooter genre outside of F.E.A.R. This game is so obsessed with small details, resulting in spectacular battles that haven't been matched since. Assault rifles operate like jackhammers as walls crumble and blood splatters. Muzzle flashes light up smoke. Grenades create physical explosions of force you can witness as they tear enemies to pieces. Bullets spark as they slam into the metal of a wall. Fuse boxes and fire extinguishers erupt, instantly destroying anyone nearby. Enemies ragdoll wildly and unleash low death rattles as you break their bones with ridiculous jumping kicks. When the smoke clears and the last of the bullet casings clink to the floor, you'll often find yourself staring in awe at the ruin you've helped bring about. The slow-mo is enough to make F.E.A.R.'s combat a standout experience. Luckily, that's just one of its many strengths. Let's talk about enemies. The soldiers you face in F.E.A.R. are so much fun to square off against because of their unique actions and smart tactics. Foes will crawl beneath tables and overturn bookshelves to flank you while you're mowing down their companions. They'll often wait till you're reloading to try and flush you out of cover with a grenade, or by aggressively running towards you. They'll shout commands to one another or scream in panic when you've killed a few of their companions. They're not infallible and they're not overly hard to take down, however the Grunt's complex actions on the battlefield are so surprising, especially for a game from 2005, that it makes beating them super satisfying, even if they have the occasional brain fart. One of F.E.A.R.'s biggest aces, as ridiculous as this might sound in a game filled with guns that can disintegrate foes and literally nail them to the wall, is its shotgun. Like Half-Life 2's gravity gun, the VK-12 shotgun isn't just a fun weapon to wield. It's a player tool that directly causes a reaction that brings F.E.A.R.'s best qualities to the forefront. Ridiculously fast and powerful, the shotgun, like the rest of the game, has no interest in being realistic. This powerful boomstick tears apart whatever is in front of it. Walls react like they've just gotten hit with rockets. Enemies will sometimes lose a head or be reduced to a red puddle. And sure, the gun's more useful against foes right in front of its barrel, but it's also a pretty effective long-range weapon. The VK-12 is a power trip, condensed to a single gun. The closest AAA video games have gotten to replicating the adrenaline-pumping, environment-ripping sequences in Hard Boiled. All of these elements, the shotgun, the fascinating enemy behavior, the combination of fantastic destruction effects with slow motion, they come together to create the best iteration of the first-person shooter's basic tenets. Now, does that mean it's the greatest first-person shooter ever made? Well, no, but what I mean to say is that there has never been a better execution of the genre's bare-bones conceit, that the player is in a room, armed with guns, and fighting enemies. Other first-person shooters take the idea and build on it with progression systems that might give you more powerful weapon attachments or class abilities, or encourage you to do tactics considerations about how you're going to approach fights. Even the nostalgia-laced reboots of Doom and Wolfenstein cater to these modern expectations by having skill trees and weapon upgrades. By contrast, the only upgrades and progression F.E.A.R. offers are slight boosts to health and slow-mo hidden away in secret areas. F.E.A.R.'s combat is wholly about the moment you step into a room with a gun and find yourself facing 5 bad guys. No planning, just instinct. A basic concept executed with perfection. One that makes you feel like you have the force of a freight train pushing you forward. That you are an all-powerful, death-dealing entity capable of chewing and spitting out any fool who gets in your way. That is, until you run into Alma. At F.E.A.R.'s dark, violent heart is Alma. Clearly inspired by the Ring's Samara, Alma is a young girl with black hair who haunts the game's darker spaces. She's often running across your field of vision and then vanishing without a trace, or spying on you from afar. She has some kind of connection to both Fettel and the ATC, one that the game doesn't make clear until towards the end, in a stomach-churning plot twist. When Alma is near, violence is never far behind, usually the kind that involves disintegrating people into skeletons or melting them into bloody goo. Surprisingly, for a game that's combat is so gory, the fruits of Alma's wrath are often left off-screen or partially obscured, with you coming across the devastation she's inflicted moments after it's happened, ratcheting the tension. We've already gone over how great F.E.A.R.'s arenas are as a means to amplifying the combat's fantastic special effects. But the environments in the quieter, more scare-centric sections of the game are also superb. These spaces are sparse and haunting, filled with flickering lights, bullet-ridden corpses, upturned furniture, and creepy sounds, like a lantern swinging in a hallway, or the distant cry of a seagull. Wherever you are in the game, whether it's an industrial warehouse, an office, or a research base buried in the earth, each location feels like another wing in a massive haunted house. Every effect in F.E.A.R is amplified. There are distinct sound effects for bullets hitting individual objects. Cans, bells, glass, even plastic jugs seem to have their own unique impact sound. Even dead bodies have their own sound for when you step into the puddle of blood next to them.
Something about health issues related to microgravity, loss of muscle mass, bone density, shit.
All of these tiny parts, the lighting, the sound effects, the claustrophobia induced by these corridors and cramped rooms, come together to put the player in a constant state of uneasiness, as well as prep them for any of the game's numerous jump scares. On all fronts, F.E.A.R is a victory for style over realism. Whether the aim is to make you feel like a bullet-spewing demigod or to draw attention to just how weak you actually are. One of F.E.A.R's smartest decisions is choosing subtlety when it comes to haunting the player, instilling a sense of, well, constant fear. Important characters, like your partner Spencer Jankowski, go missing without any tangible explanation of what happened to them. You'll see visions of them walking through hallways and leaving you with cryptic messages before dissolving Infinity War style. One can assume something bad has happened to poor Jankowski, but is he dead? Has he somehow become a telekinetic slave to F.E.A.R or Alma's mysterious powers? And why is our protagonist able to see him? Where most contemporary games would drop lore-filled codex pages explaining the exact science and reason of Jankowski's disappearance, F.E.A.R never bothers to answer any of these questions. It knows that it's much more satisfying to leave the player ruminating over Jankowski's fate. This game has several mysteries like this, and the questions it does address, like, when will I finally be able to fight the character I've been chasing for hours, are answered in the most unsettling ways possible. No matter how sure you are about the direction things are going in, you'll find that F.E.A.R never lets the player stand on solid ground. Another masterstroke is how F.E.A.R makes you feel vulnerable, while still letting you have access to your arsenal and abilities. There is no dialing back of weapons and power available to you. The unknowable lengths of Alma's powers put yours into perspective instead. You can slow down time and blow an army into smithereens with high-tech weaponry, but what good is that against an all-powerful entity that can manipulate the environment around you and attack you with terrifying hallucinations and revelations? Every short jaunt through corridors between firefights becomes riddled with tension. The possibility of Alma, F.E.A.R, of one of their many hallucinations terrorizing you remains a constant throughout the playthrough. These moments are genuinely scary, too. Sure, there are a fair number of jump scares you could argue are cheap, but they're still frightening. And just as often, there's creepy imagery happening on the outskirts of your perception. F.E.A.R is a constant parade of the macabre, and thankfully it's so disconnected from the combat elements that you're allowed to take in all those sights as an observer, with no outside elements interfering. The soldiers you fight are a threat, and they're related to the villains in a tangential way, but they are not the true source of horror in F.E.A.R. The real monsters wait, beckoning you to join them in the quiet, dark spaces, inviting you to become part of their family of shadows.
You will be a god among men.
While many action horror games start from a place of disempowerment and move the protagonist towards power, arming them with new weapons and techniques to eventually overcome the enemy, there is no such victory waiting the point man or us. F.E.A.R's structure is actually the opposite. You start from a place of power and slowly, through constant exposure to Alma and F.E.A.R's terror, learn that your power is meaningless in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't matter how many necks you snap or enemies you turn into fine red paste with ease. You cannot stop the growing darkness Alma brings into the world. Without getting too much into specific spoilers, have no doubt, all the revelations build to an ending that is downbeat and haunting, with no respite in sight. And that unrelenting, creeping commitment to bleakness is ultimately what makes Monolith's horror ambitions a grim success. F.E.A.R should not work. In the hands of less talented developers, you would have two very different games smashing into one another and bouncing off each other as a result. And yet, Monolith succeeded because so much of the game feels crafted to having players experience an equal share of strength and terror. This isn't just a classic first-person shooter or horror game, it's both. And there's never been anything quite like it since. Sadly, this includes the game's own sequels, which seemingly forgot what made their predecessors so great, and instead focused on upping the gore or shoehorning co-op. F.E.A.R is the last genuinely great first-person shooter of its generation. A masterful power trip and claustrophobic horror show united into a distinct and unforgettable experience. It deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and most importantly, it deserves to be feared.